So I really don't know how many details I'm at liberty to discuss here, but long story short, sometimes I do freelance work. I got contacted by a client, and hopefully there's no NDA issues here, but basically what they wanted is a procedural bristle system, the kind of bristles that you would see on a toothbrush, or maybe not a mop, but a broom, or maybe a vacuum. And as you can see, I've made a fully procedural system with as many controls as I can think of, and I basically want to show you how I made it, because this is a legitimate project that, you know, somebody is paying me for. So if you're interested in the world of freelance, you could be like, oh, this is the kind of thing that might be expected of me as a procedural artist. So in this tutorial, where we're going to do the client work, I've already finished it, but I'm going to show you how I did it. And before we get into client work, a message from NordVPN. My friends, my people watching, whoever happens to be on the other end of the screen, do you like being safe online, or do you like getting more out of your online experience? Then boom, NordVPN is for you. So there's kind of two camps of people. The people who know what a VPN is and know why it's useful, which is great, and people that don't know. I'm going to catch up the people that don't know. VPN is virtual private network. The point of it is your internet activities can be tracked on many kind of like levels, depending on what websites you go to, who's providing your Wi-Fi internet. There's a lot of like interception points in some sense. So a virtual private network basically remaps, it kind of like hides in some sense where the traffic is coming from to begin with, but here's why it's useful. So first of all, obviously, keeping your password safe. You're in a cafe, you're typing, you're going to your email. You wouldn't want somebody to also be in that cafe and get your data. So that's kind of the most obvious one. Fine. But there's also other features. For example, you're using Netflix. You might have heard that recently. Netflix banned password sharing, but if you use a VPN, you could kind of get around that, by the way. And also you could watch shows like on Netflix or wherever that are only available in other countries. If this sounds interesting to you, I should have a link in the description. It should be below, and let me tell you the offer that they're doing currently. You are going to get a 2-year plan with a huge discount and an extra 4 months included. So 4 free months, big discount, and it's risk-free with NordVPN's 30-day money-back guarantee, which to me says, you try it, you like it, great. You don't like it, get your money back. But if you like it, you get it discounted and 4 free months. So if you're interested in that, check it out. Cool. I'm going to use Blender 4.0 in my case. I don't really know if I'm using any nodes that really matter for this, but anyways. So we're basically making a procedural bristle generator, which boils down to kind of like instancing a bunch of curves. Of course, I want to have as many like controls as I can over this, but that's what it boils down to. And my game plan is I'm going to make a base, whether that be a circle or a square or whatever. And from this base, we're going to spawn all these like curves that are really bristles, and we're going to add parameters like random rotation, scale, direction, noise, curvature, and stuff like that. So let's take it one step at a time. Starting off, I want to have a base, so I'm going to start with a mesh circle. You can see we have it, but we need geometry to spawn stuff on it. Make it high resolution because most of this geometry is really going to come from the curves, so this doesn't matter too much. Okay. On this, we are going to distribute a bunch of points. And you could argue that, a normal distribution is fine, or you could say technically no two bristles should overlap, but I don't think you'd be able to tell. But if you do care, in which case you want to change this to Poisson disk, add a minimum distance value, and crank up this one. So as you can see, this makes sure that none of our points are overlapping. And this will be true no matter how small we make it. If this kind of looks like they are overlapping, that's because of the point radius. But you can see they're not really overlapping. Okay, so obviously, again, throughout all of this, I'm going to add a bunch of inputs that we can control. So obviously, the first one we care about is the density. Okay, it's already named density. Next one's the radius, and already you can see I can control a whole bunch of stuff, okay? Clients like revisions, they like getting what they want, and therefore giving them the controls means it's their problem now. Would recommend. Okay, on every one of these points, I'm going to give it a bristle. A bristle, for me, is going to be a curve line, which is very similar to a mesh line, but I'm going to be using this for a very specific reason. Even though curve line and mesh line effectively look the same, curve line comes with some extra data that we like. Basically, the spline parameter is what we're going to be using, and this tells us how far along the curve we are. Of course, we can use index with mesh line, but this is nice, and it updates procedurally with however many points we have. So now this curve is made up of 10 points that you can't see. Either way, this is what I'm going to instance, so we get something that looks like that. Already I'm seeing that this is too big, so I'm going to make this smaller, and let me increase the maximum density here that we can achieve, and also bring down the gap. Okay, so now I got kind of a shape I like, but it's just looking like a stack of cylinders. The reason I've kept like sniffing and stuff is I have something in my throat. Let me get it out. There we go. You ever know when you like the mucus in your nose dries and it kind of creates this dry like puck or circle, and you kind of swallow it accidentally and it gets caught in your throat? That is what just happened to me. Okay, so we want to add all kinds of controls. Let's start off with the easy ones. Scale, you can think of as basically the height. Yes, we're scaling on X, Y, and Z, but because this is kind of like a one-dimensional object, all that matters is the Z-axis. X and Y are not going to do anything. So long story short, I can straight up plug in a number in here instead of a vector, and now we have random scaling. I don't want any of these to be like, negative or a height of 0. So I'm going to map these to like 0.5 to 1, or maybe even 0.6 to 1. So at most, it can be 60% shorter. And then again, we are interested in the world of controllers. So this is also going to be a controller. Since I'm multiplying this random value, you can think of this as scaling our average height, and then maybe also a nice seed parameter. Also, I don't know why undoing after I do a second operation kind of gets rid of the name, but there you go. So, you know what? I'm just going to call this bristle demo. And I've included a seed parameter that gives us this. So again, so far we have how many bristles, how big is kind of the surface that it spawns from, what is the height, and what is our distribution like generator in some sense, the seed. And already this is a ton of control where a client can already like kind of pick what they want. But I would like to have like more control over like the randomness and stuff like that. So maybe the way we can think about this height is really as like a randomness. So let me show you what I mean. So I'm going to multiply our random value by this parameter that I'm going to call randomness. And then I'm just going to add a second number. And we'll see what that means in a second. So this one is going to be height, whereas the other one is randomness. Can I bring it up? And you can see what this does is the height does exactly what it describes, and then the randomness is kind of like the second layer on top. Although you can see it's getting a bit taller, so maybe let's center it by going negative 0.5 to 0.5. So really, the way to interpret this is by default, we have this randomness that goes down to negative 0.5 and up to 0.5, and we can scale kind of this randomness. If it's at basically 0, then our height is going to be kind of like this clean output where everything's exactly the same height. But if I add a bit of randomness, you can see we're getting some bristle variability. So it's nice to have both of those parameters. Let me just kind of play around with numbers that I like. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Next thing is that this is scaled well, but it's all pointing perfectly upwards. Of course, I want to add some random orientation and random rotation, and that's easy to do, but more so I want to add an overall like design in the sense that we added in the same sense or in the scale we added a height to this randomness. I want to add kind of like a base function to randomness. So I want something instead of, let me just show you. So for our rotation, it's going to turn out that the z-axis doesn't matter too much. It's mostly the x and the y. And without thinking too much about this, I can take a random vector without disconnecting anything, connect it to the rotation, and already we have our random thing. On average, they're going to be going in this direction because the randomness cannot go negative, so it will only go, in some sense, in the positive direction, right? This way, positive on the x, positive on the z, positive on the y. But if I make this go to -1, it will have a more, now it kind of looks like a makeup brush kind of distribution. So really, these are just like the principles of making hair. And I believe, have hair nodes already been added? Yeah, there are already hair nodes, but I assume my client wants it custom. So either way, we have all of these random rotation vectors, but even though they're going to point in different directions, you're going to see some are going to kind of rotate further out than others, right? So we are getting random directions, but they're of different magnitudes, and I actually don't want that. So I'm going to normalize this, and now you can see we're getting something a bit cleaner, right? Like none of these kind of overextend. And I'm going to kind of rein this in. So I'm going to scale, now that we know they're all the same magnitude, and we can, do something like that. Of course, this is going to be a nice little parameter that I'm going to call maybe like angle rotation or something like that. Okay. Next on the list is we have our random rotation, but like I said, I want kind of like an overall design where I can decide to kind of taper or the reverse of taper. I want to be able to kind of like puff it up so that it's more like a makeup brush, or I want to be able to pinch it so it's more like a paintbrush. So these are all kinds of different brushes we care about. Now, the way you could think about this is we have a circle that we're spawning on, and I want to say as we go away from the center, so this is our point, this is kind of like the radius or the length distance outwards. As we go along this radius vector in some sense in any direction, I want to add some kind of rotation. There are many ways to do this, but the first thing we need is to know how far away from the center we are. I think what I elected to do, so kind of the obvious thing you do is you just calculate the distance from the center, duh. But what I elected to do is the opposite. I actually calculated the distance from the edge. And you're thinking, why is that any different? Or honestly, it seems harder. What's the point? The point is if you do distance to the edge, all of the sudden I can change this to a square and it's going to work. It's not going to be this kind of thing that assumes you have a circle and a radial thing. So you know what? I'm just going to show you the general case because I think it's more useful. And I think there's a lot of tricks in this tutorial that I even learned making this. So I'm going to calculate the geometry proximity to our original disk. So I'm going to connect that here, and I want to find the nearest edge. So again, what I want you to imagine is we have a circle. We're distributing points. And for each point, I want to know what edge is it closest to, and more so, what is the distance, okay? So if I was to just kind of visualize, doing something to this, so here we have our thing as it was, but now if I add our distance, you can see it's kind of doing something that kind of depends on how radially outwards it is, and that's a good sign. So again, we have our randomness set to 0, so it's not doing anything like this. To make it more obvious, I'm going to bring down our radius, and now let's see what I can do. So we know how much this should be affected by, how much whatever setting we're doing, whether it tapers or expands, whatever the opposite of tapering is. We know the magnitude that should be at, but we don't know what orientation we want to rotate it at, right? A point over here on this edge should go outwards this way, whereas a point over here should not go in the same direction, right? It would kind of intersect our other points, so it should all kind of go outwards. And in fact, in this case, again, we could do the general case, which is more complicated, or I can do the kind of the simple case where it's a circle. But let me do the more general case. So this position actually tells us the position of the edge that it's closest to. So that's actually more information than we had before. In other words, if I subtract, and you'll see what I'm thinking in a second, if I subtract the position from our geometry thing, we're going to get a vector that's actually going to be quite useful. So I want you to imagine that we have a non-circle boundary and we have a point here. This point is going to say it's closest to this edge right over here. So it's going to find the nearest point on the perimeter, okay? What this vector is, taking the position and subtracting this, I guess we really want it the other way around, actually. What this vector is, where we take our point on the perimeter, on the edge, and then get rid of the position, is it's exactly going to describe this vector, pointing from our position to the outskirts, and it's along this direction that I want to rotate it in. Now notice, in the very general case where this is a circle, if I have a point right here, it's going to map over here, and it's going to find our nearest point. Now in a circle, it happens to be the same vector in terms of direction as going from the origin to the position, right? It's always going to go perfectly outwards because of the symmetries of a circle, but this works in a more general case in theory. So I cannot just plug this into the rotation because you see it kind of creates some messiness. It doesn't really do what you expect it to do. And this is because this is a vector quantity, and our rotation is expecting kind of like angles and stuff like that. So the vector does say what direction to rotate in, but not the actual instructions. And this is where the align Euler to vector comes in. Euler means rotation, vector means vector. So I'm going to process this vector and turn it into a rotation. So, okay. You can play around and get different settings. It seems like Z is the one I want. And now if I play around with the factor, you can see all of a sudden we're kind of getting this like radial expansion. Can I go negative with this? Seems like I can. So you can see we're kind of getting a tapering versus an expansion. And as you might have guessed, this is also going to be a parameter. We're going to call this maybe shape or something like that. And then, just like we did with the scaling, where we had a base height and then added a multiplication on top of our randomness, so too can we have our base and then add our bed of randomness. So the way I want you to think about this is the shape. I mean, I guess really we're going to be mainly tapering out, but maybe we should let our user go negative so that they can taper in. But it seems like you don't want to go very low, maybe as low as like negative 0.1. So we want our user to have nice control over the shape, but then additionally, maybe some random rotation. And this is going to look substantially better when we have more bristles at scale. So you can kind of see how this is, you know, a very controllable brush where we can get like all kinds of looks from it. So I'm just going to kind of play around with this and get a base shape that I like, and then we're going to think about what other controls would be useful to have. Now, by the way, one little caveat is whenever we're using a source of randomness like here or maybe here, it depends on the seed. So as I change the seed, it's going to give us different things, including the distribution. If they all have the exact same seed, yes, they'll be random, but they're going to be like matching relative to each other. So a point that has a very large scale will have kind of the same rotation as like itself. Basically what I'm saying is that these randomnesses are linked together, whereas I want them to have different seeds. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to offset these numbers. Oh wait, we already had a seed parameter. So maybe we take the seed number and we add 1 over here, and then maybe we take it and we add 2 over here. So no matter what seed we have, we're going to end up with different numbers at the end. Okay? So in other words, now we're getting kind of like full randomness. So just kind of play with the look that you want. Again, I want the user to be able to put way more points. So I'm going to multiply this by 2. And I guess bring this down so we can add more bristles. And there you go. I mean, honestly, this isn't too many. It's saying that it's only 600 bristles, but whatever. Okay, so this is kind of like our base, and where we start getting into realism territory is when we start adding the imperfections, right? Where this has a bit of crinkle, right? As if we've already brushed and it's been kind of used already, or kind of like overall wave shapes. And neither of these are very hard to do because we have all our curves, and then I just want to kind of alter them. So you can see I can set position afterwards, but I don't want to just pick a normal vector, not as in the normal direction, but like a regular vector. And I started typing normal for some reason. Instead, I want the source of randomness, so I'm going to use a noise texture, which is a little hard to see what it's doing, but it is creating a bit of chaos. You can see kind of moved upwards. I always say the reason for this is noise goes from 0 to 1 on XYZ. So here is 1, and on average, it's going to be equal to 0.5. If you take the zeros, the 0.2s, the 0.8s, it's all going to average to 0.5, which is why it looks like it moved 0.5 on every axis. In other words, the way you correct for this is you undo it. If it added 0.5, subtract 0.5, and that's going to center it. Additionally, we can add a scaling parameter that is looking pretty whack. I believe this is because they are instances, so we can't actually access the geometry of the curve. So here you can see there's instances. If we realize these instances, you can see all of a sudden, looks gross, but we have control. This scale, now you can see where we're going with this. This scale, would it be easier to see without selecting it? I don't know. Maybe, okay, maybe it would be easier without the grid. Yeah, I think that's pretty nice. So this scale is basically the intensity of our randomness, and you're going to see if we kind of push it, we're getting these angles, which basically tells me not really that there's too much noise. I mean, there is, but there's not enough resolution in our curve. So don't be shy. Remember, our curve, we subdivided it into 10 sections. Why not make it 30? And all of a sudden, you're getting much more smooth shapes. I think for mine I did 100, but of course the less you do this, the less resolution it's going to be in a good way, like you're saving on geometry. But I'm sure the client wants, all the quality they can get. But either way, you can think of this as our noise, and yes, there are issues here, but this is our crinkle. And then the scale is basically saying the magnitude of this distortion. So if I make this equal to 1, you can see all of a sudden, yes, there's distortion, but it's kind of like in a low frequency. Whereas if I make it something like 12, it's like a super high frequency crinkle, right? And what you can do is you can add 2 different noises together, and maybe I should add that to my project. But for me, something like 4 seems to look good. However, this does look nice, especially towards the middle top here. However, you can see the base, which was flat before, kind of loses its shape because some of it's distorting one way, some the other. As we get close to 0, will flatten back out. But basically, I want this distortion to increase as we go upwards, but be 0 at the base, which, if you were paying attention, is why I used a curve line, not a mesh line. We have a spline parameter that even when our spline is distorted, or even before, tells us how far along the curve we are. So enough talk and more doing. If I take spline parameter and I connect it as our scale, you're going to see, yes, it's more ridiculous than it was before, but our flat is bottom. Nice. Our bottom is flat. The reason that it's getting more chaotic on top is spline parameter goes between 0 and 1. 0 at the base, 1 at the top. And before we had the value 0.23, so that's our noise. But now at the top we have a value of 1, which is much bigger. Of course, the way to control this is to rein it in with a multiplication. So now we're getting the same kind of thing, but it kind of holds at the base, which makes sense. Of course, this would be a parameter that they would want. So I'm going to call this noise scale, because we also have a second parameter called maybe just like, maybe I did that wrong. Maybe this one we'll call like noise strength is more so what I was going for, whereas the other one that I literally just connected to the scale is going to be noise scale, because the scale you can actually think of as the frequency of our pattern, whereas the noise strength is going to be the intensity of that pattern, not the frequency of it. Okay, so again, you can add multiple layers of noise. You can also add controls for stuff like the detail, which I would recommend, especially if you add a lot more noise. Oh wait, that's our shape. Especially if you add a lot more noise, so maybe something like that. Bring up the thing. You can bring up your detail, and you can see all of a sudden we're getting finer details. Maybe this is an excuse to bump up our resolution again. You also want roughness controls. This one's actually pretty useful. Really, you could put every single parameter from the noise in here. They'd all be useful. But roughness really seems to kind of control our shape. So let me bring up the noise, or down the noise strength, and up the noise scale. And now you can see, I actually do like having the grid. But now you can see we're getting something that's really, really controllable. So very quickly, let's review what we have. We have the number of bristles, so kind of like the density thickness of it. We have how many we're spawning. So do we have a thin brush or a thick brush? What is randomness? Randomness, I guess, is height randomness. So you could have it be perfectly flat on top, minus the noise we're adding. And maybe that's more accurate. They probably would make the bristles all the same thing, but whatever. I'm going for extra detail. We have height randomness. We also have the average height. So you can really see, this is a cool animation. You could really see how you can make all kinds of brushes with this. We have the seed, which you can basically, by the way, now that we have another source of randomness as in noise texture, I'm going to make this 4-dimensional. Which you can think of, what is a 4-dimensional noise? It's the same thing, but now we have a seed for it. And you can see where I'm going with this. I'm going to take our seed number, and I believe W, I'm not sure about this, but I believe the W slider remains the same for different integers. Let's actually find out. So when W is equal to 0, we have this. When it's equal to 1, no. Okay, so it seems to not care. So I'm just going to add 3 like we were doing before to the W, and now the seed really should change everything, okay? Next up, we have our kind of like, this one could use a better name, but you could think of it as kind of tapering or the expansion, whatever you want to call it. Or no, this was our angle randomness. I need to give these things better names. The shape was the one that had the tapering, as you can see. It kind of gets rid of things in the middle, whereas this increases our randomness. I guess one thing you could consider, by the way, for our, let's kind of move back a little, for our angle rotation, which again depends on whatever metric, you could say that this should be scaled by the distance or the inverse of the distance. You could do that. I don't think this is that much of an issue, but if you did, you take the distance, we're going to do some math to it, and we are going to scale. Again, this is a rotation. I'm going to scale the magnitude of that. How do I scale it? Scale the magnitude of that by some kind of function here. So maybe we could do 1 minus this. So what's that going to look like? It's going to look like if we have kind of like a square base. Again, I was emphasizing all these shapes. We have a point. It's closest to its nearest edge neighbor at this point, and we're saying we're going to take the distance and basically invert it, right? So if the point is extremely close, in other words, it has a distance near 0, then 1 minus 0 is 1, and this is going to have the largest rotation. In other words, if it's on the edge, we are going to move it the most. It's going to taper the most, whereas if it's very interior, it's going to have a very large distance, such that 1 minus it should be close to 0 and it doesn't move. In fact, we don't have to kind of pick the number 1. We actually know what that number should be because we started off with a disk that has a certain radius. So I can just plug that in right there. And let's kind of see the effect of this. So this is, let's see if it's noticeable. Before, which you can see kind of has a hole in the middle, especially if I bring up the shape and bring down our randomness. You can see it has a nice hole here, or rather not nice, that we can undo. which is quite cool, actually. The only thing I'm noticing is it kind of like splits into two, which is fairly interesting. We could talk about that. We could think about that. But that is strange, huh? We have the radius minus the distance, and then we're scaling our rotation. Maybe you could think of it as we're scaling it before our thing, before our calculation. I'm not sure. So let's see. Do we still have a hole in the middle? We do. So I guess the other direction was a bit better if you use it subtly. But, I guess putting in the radius here wasn't all the way what I wanted. But what are you going to do? Okay, I'm going to call this good enough for now. But this could also be a parameter, this number right here, which kind of tells us the tendency to be towards the center. That one was a bit of a flop, but whatever. A lot of stuff to learn here. So either way, what were we going over? We were going over all the settings. So we have the shape. We have the random angle, which I think I'm going to rename. I'm going to call this random angle. We have our noise strength, which is quite important. We're only going to see that at the end here. We have our nice noise strength and our noise scale. And then we have roughness, which will really crinkle it up. So this really kind of shows how much it was used. And we could kind of do more with this base generator. But of course, at the end of the day, when we render this, nothing is going to be there really, just like infinitely thin curves. Which I believe you can render using one of these things. It's either in Simplify or maybe it's a cycles thing. You go to curves, yeah. So you could do something with this to render curves, I believe. I don't have much experience with it, but you could. But what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to get procedural control over this because I don't want these curves to just have a thickness. If this is a single like hair on this, I want it to kind of like taper like a cone. Okay, not maintain the same thickness everywhere like a cylinder. So here's how I'm going to do that. We have a bunch of curves. I want to bring them back into a mesh. So now we have this, but it's composed of points, in this case 77,000. And we need to give this a profile curve, and I'm going to be a bit careful with this. Before I do it, I'm going to bring down the resolution a lot. So we have a curve. In this case, we have a nice triangle, and we're sweeping the triangle along the curve to kind of make a triangular cylinder. If this was equal to 32, it'd be a lot of geometry. Okay, so already you can see it's blown up to 230,000 circles. And that's fine because we're doing a highly detailed thing, but that's why I want to be careful. And let's make this substantially smaller. It looks funky now, but as you decrease it, it will look better. And of course, we want to decrease it even more, but more so, I want the user to have control. So I'm going to have the user put an input in here. So this can be the thickness, and the reason I'm dividing it by, let's say, 100. So why doesn't the user just put in a small number? Why am I dividing by 100? Because it's more intuitive, and then also you can see this radius number that we like is actually quite small when it looks nearly correct. So I'm going to call this new one thickness, such that now if I go to my control, and maybe thickness should have a slider, so it can't go lower than 0 because that's infinitely thin, and let's say it can't go higher than 2, and this should be a factor, so we have a nice slider. Now you can see it's going to be extremely thin if you want really thin hairs. We have our thickness slider, and by the way, just to be cover our bases, you might want to hit fill caps, which you can see does that, so it's not hollow. Although, I don't know if that matters. I don't know if you're going to see it, especially once we taper at the top on a per strand basis. But now that we see this, you can see even though it's a triangle, it looks pretty high res. But for our hypothetical client, let's kind of bring this up. I'm okay with anything under 1 million. So even 8 points looks substantially better, and we're only at like a little over 500,000. So let's kind of art direct this. I want it to be thinner, but it still kind of looks wonky, and that's because the thing that's really going to sell it with hair, with grass, with everything, is it's not the same thickness everywhere. Usually, they kind of get thinner on top. Actually, your hair, like on your face, your head, grows as cones, but when you cut it, if you imagine you have a cone here, so your hair is a nice cone. When you cut it, it's going to make a cross section of a circle. So it's going to kind of look like a cylinder, but it's technically a cut cone. Either way, what I'm saying is we know our general thickness, but we can actually change it as we go up. And remember, if we want to change it as we go up, we did the same thing with our noise. This is where the spline parameter comes in. So here's what I'm going to do. Right now, the curve has a set radius, right? And this is a parameter of the curve. So this is going to look a little weird. If I do this, it's like infinitely thin, but by default, it expects that the radius is 1. So this is like a second controller for thickness. But this one has a factor input. It can change over position or over an index, while this one does not. That's just a constant radius. Meaning, if I now connect this here, it's going to be inverted, which is fine. We could either flip this or do a reverse curve operation. I would not recommend a reverse curve because I think that's way more computationally expensive. So if spline parameter goes from 0 to 1, which is why it's thin here and a thickness of 1 up here, and I want it to go from 1 to 0, all I need to do is, let's see, when this is equal to 1, I want it to be equal to 0, and then vice versa. So let's think about this. If I subtract 1, okay, if I subtract 1, 1 becomes 0, but 0 becomes -1, which is not what we want. So I'm going to subtract 1 and then multiply by -1. Let's check our math here. So if we start at 1, we subtract by 1, we get 0, multiply by -1, we still get 0. Great, thin up top. If we have 0, subtract by 1, we have -1, multiply by -1, we have 1, thick on the bottom. Great. So this is going to be our radius that now you can see looks like this. Now, just like the other ones, you kind of want to control the size of this effect, right? So if I ran it through another multiplication, you can see what that would do, but really we already have a parameter for thickness, so maybe I want to do an addition, right? In the same way the height could be variable, but I still choose the average height, so too the addition would kind of give it a bit of thickness. So at the top, it won't be infinitely thin. It will be the thickness of 0.06 in this case. But at the bottom, it's going to be 1 plus 0.06, right? Because the spline parameter is such that we keep all the radius, 1 in some sense, and then we add a bit of extra. So this is more so the way I'm thinking about it. We can control all of this with 2 numbers. So the first one's thickness. I'm going to call this one, I don't know, like progression. Kind of a weird way to name it. So our thickness controls, the thickness. It's more so on the multiplication side of things. And the progression, you can see, is an overall thickness like that. So if I want it to be thin on top, but also a little thinner on bottom, then I would reduce the thickness overall and keep the progression not at 0, but slightly higher. So there we go. I mean, really, I did this plus a couple of like fancy things, but that's kind of the essence of it. Let me show you one more trick that I actually learned here. So imagine we wanted to take all of this and just straight up bend it, okay? That is not only an expensive computation, but mathematically hard to do, right? Because each curve is composed of like 100 points, and we need to know where is it relative to this line and how do we distort it. And that needs to change with how much we bend it, etc. And that's doable. However, remember, we do have not a node, but a modifier for this. It's called simple deform. I'm going to pick bend, and you can see it's already bending. Now, I know what you're thinking. Great, Tom. But I like having everything in one modifier, and I agree. Which is why we are going to use this inside our geometry node. So this is something I actually learned. Here's how we're going to do it. I'm going to add another parameter, kind of like imagining that we have a bend parameter. So I want to add, do I have to add input? I'm going to call this one bend. Bend is going to be a angle quantity, so it could be whatever. And I want to take this information and somehow send it into our deform, right? So it looks like everything's in here, but actually, it's doing it on the back end over here. Well, if I right-click bend, there's a setting called copy data path. Basically, Blender has like code that runs it, obviously. But what copy data path does is it tells us what snippet of code directs to this number. Okay, it's kind of like a pointer in some sense. Might actually be a pointer, I'm not sure. So we're going to copy data path. And then here, this angle that actually modifies things, this is where we want it to go. So here, I don't believe there's a paste data path. So I'm going to add a driver. If you've never seen the driver editor, welcome. It's a little confusing. Basically what the driver does, and you can see it's made this thing purple. What the driver editor does is it kind of fills in this number with a custom function. Very similar to how we do it in geometry nodes. So let me walk you through it. I'm just going to get rid of everything. So right now, this expression, which doesn't exist, is going to fill in the purple thing. For that, I wanted to just kind of take the bend number from our geo nodes, okay? So I'm going to add an input variable, okay? We haven't said what this variable does or whatever, but I'm going to give it a name. You can call it bend, you can call it angle, it really doesn't matter. But the question is, what data is it going to pull from, okay? So make sure this is set to single property. So I'm going to make a property called angle, and that property is going to be of the cube. Okay, so here we're getting a little confusing. So we have a driver. It's using data, but first of all, it needs to know where that data is located. That data is located in our bristle object. So let me just rename it. It's located in our bristle object, which before was called cube. So now you can see it goes into our bristle object, and then the data path we're looking at, we can paste that thing we copied before. You can see what it says is it's the modifier, geometry node, socket 14, and that's what we want, update dependency. Now this by itself, isn't going to do anything, right? This doesn't change anything. But by the way, you can see, so here when we're in the modifier, and you can see we have 1, 2, 3, 4, blah, blah, blah. We should have 14 of these. Maybe it's 13 with the hidden geometry nodes one. I don't know, geometry one, but you can kind of see why it's called that. The last thing I need to do now that we have our variable that we defined called angle, whatever, is it uses this expression to define what the purple should be. So the purple is going to be equal to this expression. Yes, I've made a variable here, but I didn't use it in our expression. So again, our variable in this case is called angle, so I'm just going to type it in, and now it should update relative to this. Just a bit of a tip. I don't know if it matters in this case, but select use self, which would be useful for when we make a duplicate of this. But now you can see that I'm changing this number inside the modifier. Here's 90 degrees. Here's 180 degrees, which is half a full rotation. And I can also go negative. And you can see I can now control that inside of geometry nodes, and more so, I can just kind of hide that and imagine it never existed. So that's a cool little thing, and it's going to work with everything we've done. So I'm going to bring down the shape and then do the angle. Of course it's going to work because it's the modifier after the fact. So that's just a cool little trick. And, let's just do it one more time. I did add a parameter for kind of the same thing, but instead of bending, this time it was twisting. So let me make the bend equal to 0. And here's our twist. By the way, if we increase our twist, let's see what that looks like. Doing some weird stuff because it's twisting on about the x-axis. I wanted to do it kind of vertically, like a barbershop pole. So that's going to be about the vertical z-axis in theory. Okay, So I don't know if you can see it. Let me show you the progression. We have our thing, and then, by the way, I know we're at the very end of the tutorial, but that doesn't mean I can't increase visibility. Does that help at all? I don't know. But either way, you can see as I increase the twist, it's actually twisting up. Although I think it's a bit more visible, but it is kind of killing the computer a little, which is fine, but I don't want it to kill the recording. That happened on one of my last tutorials. I'm going to do the same thing. So again, in geometry nodes, I'm going to add a new input. And that input is going to be called twist. Twist is also going to be an angle quantity. I'm going to copy the data path. So this is a pretty powerful idea, and I'll show you what more it can do. But I'm going to copy the data path. For the twist angle, I'm going to add a driver. And now we know really how to do this. I'm going to get rid of our expression. I'm going to get rid of our variable. I'm going to make one called twist angle. Again, it doesn't matter what you call it as long as you call it the same thing every time. This is going to look at the bristle self-object, and this is the path now socket 15. Update the dependency, and then finally the expression should be just our variable. Now you could do something weird where you like multiply it by 2. So we'll take our geonodes number and multiply it by 2, but I wouldn't want to do that. So now we have twist. And by the way, the reason that I put twist underneath of bend is now we can do one after another, okay? So just to show you, I'm going to bring down the density so it performs a bit faster. I'm going to first of all twist, let's say by 360 degrees. So you can see it's done this twist. Of course, it's a lot. But then we're going to do our bending. So you can see you can kind of stack these ideas together. This is what Simon Toms did, I think, with the hair geometry nodes that I don't really want to get into yet because I like making my own thing. But I think this is essentially what he did. And now that we have it, I mean, this is basically it. I just want to kind of make a final bristle that I'm proud of. So let's kind of go for a makeup brush. Okay, we need some kind of theme. So for a makeup brush, it's kind of should look like this, right? Kind of like a diamond with a flat base or something. Either way, I want it to expand. That's what the shape is for, but also random angle because I don't think we were able to figure it out with the center perfectly. This is looking like a very abused makeup brush. So I kind of want to bring down most of our sources of randomness. So I don't want any of them to be 0, just slightly. One of the things that's making this look weird is our noise strength. So if I get rid of it, you can see all of a sudden it's nice and organized. I do want it to have just the slightest bit of high or low frequency noise. Maybe a little higher frequency. You can kind of play around with this. That's why we made all these parameters. Okay. And now the thing that is making this not look correct, I believe, is just kind of like the density of this. But you could play around with it all day. So how do I want to do this? I think they should have pretty thick tips because that's the whole point. Can I increase the density factor to 2? No. This one should also probably be a parameter, but I believe we have to go in here. And that's going to bring up our density. Great. And now I'm just going to kind of bring this all together. Excuse my silence. I'm just trying to focus. Okay. So that's not too bad. It's not too bad. The only thing that I would want to do, actually, and this is specific to this brush, I guess, are all the bristles the same length, or do they get shorter on the outskirts? If that is the case, I know how to do that, but I don't know if that's actually true. I think it's actually just much shorter than I think it is. So that's kind of like that kind of brush. Maybe it needs like more high, like this isn't looking perfectly correct to me. That definitely isn't either, but yeah, maybe it's this like subtle crinkling that kind of does it. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. But I'll stop messing around with this in a second. Okay. So clearly I need to do some work on this, but in theory, all the things we need for this are in the generator, okay? This is AKA not my problem. But it would be nice to know that like everything you'd want to make is possible to make with this, of course. Can I even make this slower? There we go. I think we just need like a lot of geo. There we go. That actually looks pretty close in my head. It's just getting rid of some of that subtle randomness that's going to really put this together. Okay, that actually doesn't look too bad. What was I going to say? So we've made the brush. Oh yeah, I wanted to try that idea I had before. Remember I did the geo proximity, and I said that in theory should work with any shape like a square. Let's see if that's actually true. It's a little hard to tell, but I think it is. To check, let me get rid of some of these that are making it not obvious. Yeah, there you go. So you have a square. You have a square spawner, and these are going to go in the correct direction. Yeah, that's nice. Let's like really stress test this and increase the shape. Yeah, so you can see it unfolds in some sense, which is exactly what I wanted. Okay, cool. You can even make a nice little X here. I think that issue I had a while ago where it was spreading like it is, but not with the correct scaling, is some kind of function depending on this distance. I haven't cracked it exactly. Maybe it's because my like values are incorrect, but it's going to be something dependent on that. You mark my words. But yeah, I'm not 100% sure, to be honest. But either way, maybe one of you knows how to do it. And I think that is basically what I wanted to say. So let's do a nice little cleanup, a low effort cleanup. If you didn't know, there's a cool add-on you can get. I don't think I even have it. That comes with Blender. It's called Node Arrange. Let's see. It's called Node Arrange. You enable it, and what it does is you select all your nodes that you want to organize, and I really don't want to organize them. That's the point. And you click Arrange All Nodes. And look at that. I don't know if this is the best arrangement, but I can like compress it. I can stretch it. I can probably do some other things. I don't really know. Looks like you're able to mess with the nodes overall size or something like that. I don't know. Either way, that's another cool little trick that I don't use too often. So let's just kind of rename these. At this point, I want to do my kind of spiel where I say that this project is available on Patreon. I don't know if you want to just use it or use it as a base for something or just kind of learn from it. But if you, okay, hold up. What am I doing? Go full screen. But if you're interested in getting this blend file, but more relevantly, every blend file I've ever made for like 3 to 4 years, you can go to Patreon, and for $5, you can have it all, including this, which I think by itself is worth more than $5, but you could get everything. You get early access to tutorials, which in fact I uploaded one today about the using geometry nodes as a game engine for Minecraft. I think that's actually a really cool idea. But early access, project files, and occasionally, very rarely, exclusive tutorials. So link in the description for the file, and good luck on your client work. I mean, that was kind of the point of this.